At 78, Richard Thompson never imagined the sharpest wound of his life would come, not from strangers, but from the very son he had raised with his own two hands. It happened on what should have been an ordinary Sunday dinner inside his own brick home in Ohio. Around the table sat his son, David, David's wife, Karen, and a few of their friends. The air was warm, the smell of roast chicken still drifting from the kitchen. When suddenly, David's voice cut through the chatter like a knife. "Dad, stop being such a nosy old man. This dinner isn't for you." For a moment, time seemed to stop. Richard froze, fork still in hand. He searched the table for a single look of defense, a hint of compassion, yet no one moved. No one spoke. The friends sipped their wine as if nothing had happened. Even Karen, who had leaned on Richard for advice and comfort so many times before, lowered her eyes and said nothing. It was in that instant Richard realized something devastating. In his own home, at his own table, he was no longer a father or even a man to be respected. He had become an unwelcome guest. What burned wasn't only the insult, but the silence of those who chose not to stand beside him. That night, Richard finished his meal in quiet dignity, but in his heart, a storm had begun to rise. That night, long after the guests had gone, Richard Thompson sat alone in his dimly lit living room. The grandfather clock ticked steadily yet. Each sound pressed against his chest like a weight. He stared at the family portraits on the wall, images of birthdays, graduations, Sunday afternoons in the backyard. Photographs of a life he had built, brick by brick, loaf by loaf, sacrifice by sacrifice. Richard's mind wandered back to his years as a baker. For 45 years he had risen before dawn, often when the stars still clung to the sky, to prepare bread for families across their small Ohio town. He remembered carrying 50-pound sacks of flour up the narrow steps of his bakery, his arms aching but his spirit strong. Neighbors relied on him, and he never let them down. What most didn't know was that behind those tired hands and flour-dusted aprons stood a father who worked not for recognition, but for one little boy, his son David. When David was only 5, Richard's wife, Eleanor, passed away suddenly. From that moment forward, Richard vowed he would be both father and mother. He refused to remarry, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want his son to feel replaced or second best. Many evenings, when other men relaxed with a beer, in front of the television, Richard sat at David's bedside, cooling a fever or reading a story to ease his boy into sleep. Those were long, quiet nights filled with whispers of encouragement and the soft hum of a father's promise. "I'm here. You'll never be alone." As David grew, Richard gave more than money could measure. He skipped vacations, drove the same rusty Ford pickup for 20 years, and wore shoes until the soles nearly fell apart all so his son could have a new jacket, a basketball, or a chance at college. When David was old enough to dream of starting a business, Richard made the hardest decision of his life. He sold his beloved bakery. The building that held his sweat, his pride, his very identity, was handed over to strangers so David could have seed money for his first venture. At the time, Richard felt no regret. Watching his son drive away in a used Chevy, keys to his new office in hand, filled him with quiet pride. He thought to himself, this is what being a father is. This is what love is for. But as he sat in that silent living room decades later, the memory no longer comforted him, pierced him. The very child he had lifted through every storm had now cast him aside with a single sentence. The roast chicken, the wine glasses, the laughter of strangers, they had become symbols of betrayal. Richard pressed his palms together and whispered into the emptiness. When did I stop being his hero? When did I become the burden he wanted to sweep aside? His voice cracked, but no answer came. It would have been easier to explode at the dinner table, to slam his fist and demand respect. But Richard had always been a man of quiet strength, never one for dramatics. Instead, he endured, let the insult settle deep into his bones, and carried his pain upstairs like a heavy suitcase. Yet, as dawn approached, a shift stirred within. Him, the humiliation wasn't the end. It was a wake-up call. For years, he had given without asking, endured without complaint, and loved without limits. But now the question was not what he owed his son. The real question was, what did he owe himself? As the first rays of sunlight slipped through the curtains, Richard knew one thing for certain. He could not continue living as a shadow in the very house he built. He had raised his son with discipline and compassion, but somewhere along the way, David had forgotten that respect was the only repayment ever asked. Richard stood, his back stiff but his heart steady. He walked toward the study where he kept his papers neatly filed away. The truth lay in those documents, in the very deed of the home where his son had just humiliated him. With every step, his resolve hardened. The night had broken him, yes, but the morning would rebuild him. Richard woke before dawn the next morning. Habit had trained his body to rise early, but this time there was no reason to head for the bakery, no loaves to knead, no customers to greet. He sat on the edge of his bed, the house quiet, except for the soft hum of the furnace. His hands rested heavy on his knees as if the years of sacrifice had finally settled into his bones. He couldn't stop hearing his son's voice from the night before, sharp, dismissive, and final. "This dinner isn't for you." Those words clung to him, not as a moment of anger, but as a declaration that in his own home, he no longer belonged. For hours, Richard stared at the wall. Memories flickered through his mind. David as a boy running through the yard with a baseball glove too big for his hand, the way he used to fall asleep on Richard's shoulder during Sunday sermons, the smile that once lit his face when he called his father a hero. How had those memories faded into this cold silence? By mid-morning, something inside him shifted. Richard rose and walked to his study, the small room that smelled faintly of paper and cedar. He opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was the deed to the house, the two-story brick home he had, built with calloused hands and stubborn determination. His name, Richard A. Thompson, was still printed on the line of ownership. He had never signed it over. Despite David's constant urging, Richard remembered the excuses David had used over the years. "Dad, it'll be easier for taxes. Dad, it'll protect us if something happens." At the time, Richard had brushed it off as unnecessary paperwork. Now, staring at his own name, he realized that hesitation had saved him. The house was still his. The thought ignited a quiet fire in his chest. This was not just wood and brick. It was decades of sacrifice, his sanctuary. His wife's laughter still echoing in the corners, his own sweat soaked into every nail and beam. No one, especially not his own son, was going to strip him of that dignity without saying a word. To anyone, Richard slipped on his old flannel jacket and drove into town. The locksmith raised an eyebrow when Richard requested new locks for every door, even the garage and side entrance. But Richard's tone left no room for questions. By the time he returned home, his resolve was firm. He waited until David and Karen left for their usual Saturday shopping trip. Then, with steady hands, he replaced each lock, one by one, the metallic clicks echoing like small declarations of independence. For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel like an aging man trying to hold on. He felt like a father reclaiming his place. When David returned and tried the door, the rattle of keys turned quickly into pounding fists. Karen's voice carried through the door. "Dad, what are you doing? You're shutting us out." Richard stood in the hallway, envelope in hand. He slid it beneath the crack of the door. Inside was a simple letter written in his neat handwriting. "This house is mine again. You have 1 week to collect your things. Please respect this, Richard." On the other side, the shouting grew louder, then quieter, then finally dissolved into silence. Richard leaned against the wall, his breath steady. For once, he did not feel the need to explain, argue, or apologize. That night, as he sat in the living room with a cup of coffee, Richard felt the familiar ache of loneliness, but beneath it was something new. Peace. Wasn't revenge. It was simply the relief of a man who had drawn a line and chosen not to cross it again. As the wind rattled the windows, Richard whispered into the stillness, "This is my home. This is my life. And I won't be erased." For the first time in years, he slept soundly. Knowing that the house and his dignity were finally his again, Richard expected a storm the moment his son realized the locks had been changed. And yes, there was shouting, pounding on the door. even accusations hurled through the crack of the frame. Duh. But Richard didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't explain. He stood quietly inside, his hands folded, letting the noise wash over him like rain against a window. It wasn't that he didn't feel the sting, of course he did. Every word David shouted tore at his heart, yet deep inside Richard had learned something important in his 78 years. Not every battle is worth a scream. Sometimes the sharpest answer is silence. So instead of shouting back, he let his actions speak. The locks were changed, the line was drawn, and there was nothing more to add. For the next few days, the house remained unnervingly still. Richard moved through each room like a man relearning his own space. He brewed coffee in the morning, walked the creaking floors, opened the curtains wide to let in light. And though the quiet was heavy at first, it slowly began to feel like freedom. He was no longer tiptoeing around, worried about being in the way. The home finally breathed with him again, but Richard knew the conflict with David had forced him to face a bigger truth. It wasn't only about a house, it was about legacy. All his life, he had imagined leaving behind something for his son, a way of saying, "I kept my promise to provide." Now, sitting at the kitchen table with his old checkbook and file folders spread before him, Richard wondered if leaving everything to David would mean giving away not only his possessions, but also his dignity. So he made a decision that even surprised himself. One cold Tuesday morning, Richard put on his wool coat and drove downtown to a law office he hadn't visited in years. The receptionist greeted him kindly, and soon he was sitting across from his attorney, a man who had once helped him draft his will decades earlier. With a calm but steady voice, Richard explained that he wanted to make changes. The attorney asked if he was certain. Richard nodded. "I don't want my life's work to reward disrespect. If my son can't value me while I'm here, he doesn't deserve to profit when I'm gone." Instead, Richard redirected his estate. He arranged for the house, his modest savings, and what remained of his retirement to go to a local foundation that cared for abandoned seniors. Men and women who, like him, had given everything to their families, only to be left behind. The thought brought a bittersweet comfort. His sacrifices would still matter, just not in the way he once imagined. Walking out of that office, papers signed and sealed, Richard felt lighter. Not happy exactly, but resolved. He thought about how David might react one day when he learned of it. Anger, shock, perhaps regret, but Richard had stopped living for his son's approval. What mattered now was that his choices honored the man he had always tried to be that night. Richard sat at his dining table with a simple meal soup and bread he had baked earlier in the day. He raised the spoon to his lips, and for the first time in months, the food didn't taste like routine. It tasted like strength. It tasted like reclaiming a part of himself he thought was gone forever. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the familiar walls of the house. He knew the silence would linger, maybe for the rest of his days. But within that silence, there was dignity, different kind of inheritance one. He would carry with him until the end, and though no one else might have been there to hear it. Richard whispered into the stillness, "I choose peace, even if I have to choose it alone." The first week after David and Karen left was the hardest. The house felt enormous, almost hollow, with every creak of the floorboards echoing louder than before. Richard had fought for his dignity, yes, but at night when the rooms were dark and quiet, his loneliness slipped in like an uninvited guest. He would find himself listening for sounds that weren't there anymore. The shuffle of David's shoes coming down the stairs, the clink of Karen's coffee cup on the counter. Silence has a way of reminding you not only of who's gone, but of what you once hoped to have. Richard often sat at the kitchen table staring at the clock, wondering if this was the price of finally standing up for himself. But life has its small surprises, and sometimes they arrive when you least expect them. One crisp afternoon, while Richard was sweeping his front porch, his young neighbor Linda called over the fence. Her little boy Ethan, about 6 years old, tugged at her sleeve and pointed toward Richard's yard. "Mr. Thompson," Linda asked softly, "would it be all right if Ethan played in your yard for a while I run to the store? He just loves your garden." Richard hesitated for a moment. It had been a long time since a child's voice filled the air around his home. Then he nodded. Of course, let him run. Ethan's laughter rang out as he chased butterflies through the flower beds and poked around the bird bath. Richard leaned on his broom and couldn't help but smile. It stirred something deep inside him, a memory of another little boy decades ago who once filled this same yard with the same kind of carefree joy. From that day on, Ethan came more often. At first, it was just for a few minutes at a time. But soon he was knocking on Richard's door, asking if Grandpa Richard could come outside and play catch or show him how to whittle wood. Linda would sometimes join them, bring in a plate of cookies or a fresh loaf of banana bread. She seemed grateful for Richard's company, too. More than once he caught her lingering a little longer, as though she found comfort in his steady presence. The house slowly began to change with these visits. The once heavy silence was broken by Ethan's footsteps, the squeak of a ball bouncing on the driveway, and the innocent questions of a child eager to learn about the world. Richard showed him how to fold paper boats to float in the rain puddles, and later how to knead dough just right so it would rise soft and fluffy. When the boy's first loaf came out hard as a rock, Richard chuckled and said, "Don't worry. Sun bread is like people, it takes time to grow into itself." One evening, Ethan presented Richard with a crayon drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house. Above them were the words, "My grandpa makes bread with love." Richard held the paper in his hands longer than he meant to, his eyes stinging in a way he hadn't expected. That night, as he taped the drawing to the refrigerator, he realized something powerful. Family isn't always tied by blood. Sometimes it finds you in the laughter of a child who chooses to love you, or in the kindness of a neighbor who sees your worth without you having to prove it. Of course, the ache for David never fully disappeared. A father's heart doesn't. Just close, but slowly, Richard began to notice that his days weren't defined by that ache anymore. They were shaped by new routines, watering the garden with Ethan at his side, sipping coffee with Linda on the porch, or simply sitting in the evening breeze without feeling like an unwelcome presence in his own home. For the first time in a long time, Richard caught himself laughing out loud, real laughter, the kind that comes from deep inside. And in that moment, he understood something he wished he'd known years earlier, even after the deepest betrayal. Life has a way of offering second chances. Not with the same people, perhaps, but with new ones who teach you that love, respect, and dignity can return in unexpected forms. It wasn't long before the silence was interrupted not by Ethan's laughter or Linda's gentle visits, by the sound Richard had dreaded, a fist pounding against the front door. It was David. "Dad, open up. We need to talk." His voice carried the same authority he once used at the dinner table, but now it sounded desperate, hollow. Richard stayed still in the hallway, listening as the knocking grew harder. He didn't answer. Instead, he slipped a plain envelope under the door, the same way he had the first time. Inside was a short note. "This house is no longer yours to claim. Take care of yourself, Dad." The pounding stopped. For a moment, Richard thought it was over. But a week later, another knock came, softer this time. When he peered through the curtain, he saw David standing there with a small box in his hands. Richard opened the door just wide enough to see. "I brought back the house keys," David said quietly. His eyes looked sunken, his hair unkempt. He handed the box over. Inside were the old brass keys Richard had once given him years ago. Richard took them, nodded once, and closed the door without another word. His heart clenched, but he knew what he was doing. Allowing David back in would only reopen wounds that hadn't healed. A few months later, a letter arrived in the mailbox. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Richard sat on the porch and read, "Dad, I know I failed you. I can't erase what I said. I can't undo what I did. But please believe me when I say I regret it every day. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know." Richard folded the letter and placed it inside the same drawer where he had stored the deed to the house. He didn't reply. It's not because he felt nothing, but because he had finally learned that forgiveness didn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it meant protecting the peace you fought so hard to gain. Still, there were moments that tugged at his soul. One autumn evening, As Richard sanded a piece of wood for a birdhouse, he noticed a figure standing by the gate. It was David. Again, thinner now, with dark circles under his eyes. He didn't push the gate open. He didn't shout. He just looked at his father and whispered, "I just wanted to see you." Richard put down his tools and walked toward the porch. His voice was steady. "Well, you've seen me." For a moment it felt like they were frozen in time, father and son on opposite sides of a fence, separated by more than just distance. David's lips trembled as if he wanted to say more, but instead he lowered his gaze and walked away. That night Richard sat in his recliner staring at the keys David had returned months earlier. The pain was still there, but alongside it was something else. Clarity. He realized he didn't hate his son. He didn't wish him harm. He just couldn't allow himself to be humiliated again. In a strange way, David's absence had given Richard a new sense of strength. He learned that love without respect is only weakness. He learned that setting boundaries didn't make him cruel, it made him whole. As weeks turned into months, David's visits became less frequent. Sometimes Richard would catch sight of him across the street, standing in the shadows, as if waiting for courage he never found. Other times, nothing at all. Each time Richard chose not to chase, not to invite, not to beg. The door remained closed, and with it, the wound began to scar instead of bleed, and while part of him longed for the son he once knew, Richard began to see the truth more clearly. The boy who had once clung to his leg, calling him a hero, was gone. What remained was a man who had lost his way. Whether he found it again was no longer Richard's burden to carry in the quiet of his home. With Ethan's drawing still taped proudly to the refrigerator, Richard whispered to himself, "I will not let my heart be a doormat, not even for my own son." And for the first time in years, he felt no guilt for saying it. The months that followed were quieter, but not empty. For the first time in years, Richard began to wonder what his days might look like if he stopped waiting for phone calls that never came, for apologies that might never arrive. For a son who seemed to have drifted too far away, it was Linda, his neighbor, who nudged him out of his solitude. One afternoon she stopped by with Ethan, carrying a plate of cornbread still warm from the oven. "They're having a community meeting at the senior center this week," she said. "They need volunteers for a new food program. Should you come? You'd be good at it." Richard almost laughed at the idea. Him, at 78, volunteering again? But that night, as he sat in his recliner with the TV droning in the background, he realized the house had grown too quiet. He missed the hum of life around him. Maybe Linda was right. That Thursday he walked through the doors of the senior center. The smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls greeted him, along with a dozen older faces gathered in folding chairs. Some were widows, some were grandfathers like him, and some just looked like they needed a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Richard signed his name on the volunteer list, unsure of what he was really signing up for. At first his role was simple helping. Organize the pantry, stacking cans, making grocery bags for families in need. But as weeks passed, the director of the center asked if he would share a little of his own story during one of the group gatherings. "You've got that steady way about you," she said. "People would listen." Richard hesitated. He'd never thought of himself as a storyteller. But the following Tuesday, he stood at the front of the room, hands clasped, and began to speak. He talked about the bakery, about the smell of fresh bread rising before dawn, about the way flour covered, everything like a dusting of snow. He told them how he learned to measure patience not by the clock, but by the way dough felt beneath his hands. Slowly he noticed something unexpected. No one looked away. No one interrupted. Every eye was on him, every smile genuine. For the first time since his wife passed, Richard felt truly heard. After that, storytelling became part of his week. Sometimes he spoke about his childhood in Ohio, playing stickball on the corner with neighborhood kids until the streetlights flickered on. Other times he spoke about Eleanor, the way she laughed when the rain ruined their picnic, how she could make even the worst days feel manageable. Each story carried pieces of himself, offered not as complaints or confessions, but as living proof that a life well lived leaves behind more than regrets. One evening, after finishing a story about his Very first bakery order, a woman in the crowd wiped her eyes. She approached him later and whispered, "I wish my father had told me stories like that before he passed." Hearing yours felt like hearing his voice again. Richard went home that night with a fullness he hadn't known in years. Little by little, the man who once sat in silence at his own dinner table began to find his voice again. He wasn't just Richard the father, or Richard the baker, or Richard the man left behind. He was Richard the storyteller. People wanted to listen. The change even showed in his home. Fixed up the porch swing, painted the front steps, fresh coat of blue, and began to greet neighbors with more than just a nod. He carried himself straighter, not from pride, but from the quiet assurance that his life still held purpose. There were still nights when the ache of David's absence returned, when the house seemed too big and the bed too cold. But now, instead of drowning in that emptiness, Richard had places to go, people to meet, and words that mattered to someone besides himself. One Tuesday evening, after finishing a story about the first Thanksgiving he ever hosted, a gentleman at the back raised his hand and said, "You know, Richard, you've got a gift.
Oh.
Some of us just live through our years, but you make us feel them." Richard smiled, a small smile that reached his eyes. For once he didn't feel like an old man clinging to the past. Felt like a man living in the present, building something new out of the broken pieces. And as he walked home that night under the street lamps, he thought to himself, "I may have lost my son, but I haven't lost myself." As Richard's world began to steady again, his home slowly filled with new sounds. Not the heavy footsteps of his son, not the clipped conversations of Karen, but the lighter, sweeter rhythm of a child's laughter and the gentle presence of a neighbor who showed up not out of obligation, out of genuine care. Ethan had grown bolder since that first afternoon in the yard. He no longer waited for permission to come by. He'd bound across the grass with a soccer ball under his arm or a drawing clenched in his little fist. "Grandpa Richard, look what I made," he'd shout, holding up a picture of stick figures with big smiles. Richard always took the paper, with a seriousness that made the boy beam as if his art belonged in a museum. Linda often followed with a smile and a wave. Carrying a basket of muffins or fresh produce from the farmer's market, she never lingered just out of politeness. She stayed because she wanted to. Sometimes they'd sit on the porch, sipping coffee while Ethan chased fireflies in the yard. They talked about small things, whether grocery prices, the quirks of neighbors, but beneath the surface. Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years, companionship without their judgment. It wasn't long before these visits turned into traditions. On Saturdays, Ethan helped Richard with small projects in the garage. Together they built a birdhouse, hammered crooked nails, and painted it with streaks of blue and yellow. The boys' brush strokes were clumsy, but to Richard it looked perfect. When they hung it on the oak tree out front, Ethan clapped his hands and shouted, "Now the birds will have a home, just like me." The words caught Richard off guard. He swallowed hard, realizing the boy wasn't just talking about birds. One Sunday morning, Linda surprised Richard with a casserole and an invitation. "Would you join us for dinner tonight?" she asked. Richard hesitated. He hadn't sat at anyone else's table since that night with David, but when he saw Ethan's eager grin, he agreed. That evening, sitting across from Linda and Ethan at their modest kitchen table, Richard felt an unexpected warmth. It wasn't the meal lit, was the way Linda bowed her head and asked Ethan to say grace. The way the boy whispered, "Thank you for Grandpa Richard," in his prayer. Richard blinked back tears before anyone could notice. Little by little, the ache of loss gave way to something softer. It wasn't that he stopped missing David. No father could. But he began to understand that love doesn't always return from where you poured it. Sometimes it comes from unexpected places, filling cracks you thought would remain empty forever. One evening, after walking Ethan home, Richard returned to find a note taped to his front door. It was from Linda. "Thank you for being here for us. You may not realize it, but you've become part of our family." He read those words over and over, his hand resting against the doorframe. Part of our family. Not because of blood, not because of duty, but because of choice. That night, as he sat in his favorite chair with Ethan's latest drawing pinned to the fridge, Richard whispered to himself, "Maybe this is what I was meant to find all along. A family that chooses me, not one that endures me. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like an old man holding on to what was lost. He felt like a grandfather again, a neighbor, a friend, someone still capable of giving love and receiving it in return. Asterisk, as the seasons shifted, Richard's life began to settle into a rhythm he never expected. There were still moments when the ache of David's absence pressed against his chest, especially on holidays when memories crept in uninvited. But those moments no longer defined him. Instead, he found himself shaping new traditions with Linda's quiet kindness, with Ethan's unstoppable curiosity, and with the neighbors who now greeted him not with pity, but with respect. One crisp autumn afternoon, Richard was sitting on the porch sanding a piece of wood for another birdhouse. Across the street, he noticed a familiar figure. David stood there for a moment, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't cross over, didn't call out. He just looked, as if the distance between them wasn't only the width of the road, but the weight of years of silence. Richard's heart clenched, but he stayed where he was. He'd learned that sometimes protecting your peace meant letting someone remain on the other side of the street. That night, Richard reflected on something that had been growing inside him for months. He realized the love he once poured endlessly into David had not disappeared, had simply shifted. It had gone into Ethan's laughter, into the stories he shared at the senior center, into the bread he baked for neighbors who knocked on his door. Love had not died. It had just taken a new shape. Still, couldn't help but mourn, not for the son who walked away, but for the boy David once was, the boy who had drawn him crayon pictures with the words, "Dad, you're my hero." Sometimes Richard would open the old box where he kept those drawings and sit quietly with them in his lap. He no longer cried, but a deep sigh always escaped, the kind that comes from knowing a chapter of life will never be rewritten. What struck him most was the clarity of it all. Blood alone doesn't bind a family. Respect does, care does, presence does. Without those, blood is little more than ink on a birth certificate. Richard realized he could love David from afar, but he didn't need to let himself be diminished in the process. That was the difference. Between clinging to hope and choosing dignity, the turning point came one Sunday morning at the senior center. Richard had just finished telling a story about his early days in the bakery when a man in the back, about his age, raised his hand. "My son doesn't talk to me anymore either," the man said softly. "But hearing you today makes me feel like maybe I'm not broken, maybe I just need to live with what I have left." The room fell silent, every head turned toward Richard. He could have given advice, but instead, he simply said, "We can't force anyone to love us. We can choose not to stop living while we wait." The man nodded, eyes wet, and Richard realized he wasn't just telling his own story anymore. He was helping others carry theirs. That evening, back home, Richard sat with a cup of coffee at his kitchen table. Ethan's drawings were still taped to the refrigerator, bright reminders of a love freely given. He thought of David again, his shadow across the street. The letters filled with regret, and for the first time Richard didn't feel anger, nor did he feel longing. What he felt was acceptance. He whispered aloud into the quiet, "I may not have the son I thought I'd raise, but I still have the man I chose to become." And in that moment he understood something that had taken a lifetime to learn. You can lose many things in this world, possessions, dreams, even relationships, but if you hold on to your dignity, you haven't truly lost yourself. Winter came. Slow that year. Snow gathered in soft layers along the windowsills, and the old oak out front stood bare against the pale sky. Inside, Richard's home felt different now, because it was filled with noise or activity, but because the silence no longer carried the weight of rejection. It carried peace. He spent his mornings with coffee in hand, watching the sunrise creep across the frosted lawn. Some days Ethan would come bouncing in with a school project, asking Richard for help. Other days, Linda would stop by with a pie and they'd share quiet conversation at the kitchen table. These small moments stitched themselves into Richard's life, creating a new kind of family, one born of choice rather than obligation. But every so often, Richard's mind drifted back to David. He wondered where he was, if he was working, if he still carried the same bitterness in his heart. He never reached out, not because he hated his son, but because he had accepted the truth. Sometimes distance is the only way to keep dignity alive. One afternoon, while cleaning out a cedar chest in his bedroom, Richard found an old drawing David had made when he was 7. It was a crayon sketch of the two of them standing in front of the bakery, smiling with the words, "When I grow up, I want to be like my dad." Richard held the paper for a long time, the edges yellowed with age. Didn't cry this time. Instead, he smiled, grateful that at least once, even for a brief season, he had been seen that way. It was then he realized something powerful. Love doesn't disappear, just because it isn't returned the way we hoped. Every act of sacrifice, every long night at the bakery, every moment spent guiding his son all still mattered. It shaped who Richard was. It proved he had given his best, even if the outcome was different than he dreamed. And with that realization, Richard chose not to measure his life by what he had lost, but by what he had given in, what he had gained in return. The truth is, Ethan's laughter and Linda's kindness had reminded him of something vital. Family isn't just who you raise. Under your roof, family is anyone who respects you, stands beside you, and welcomes you with love. That's a lesson Richard carried into his final years, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Richard's story teaches us something we all need to hear. Dignity is not negotiable. You can forgive, you can love, but you should never beg for a place in someone's heart. Family is not only blood, it's respect, it's kindness, it's presence. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is to let go of the hope that keeps us chained to pain and open our doors to the love that comes from unexpected places. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to set boundaries, even with someone you love deeply? Share your experience in the comments. I promise you're not alone. And if you want more stories that move the heart and speak to life's hardest truths, make sure to subscribe and join our growing community. Your voice matters here.